Really good to see you this morning, as well as to welcome those who are connecting online. We are diving in today to our new focus and fall series on building better relationships. As I shared last week as part of an introduction, it really is a time in which we want to do just that, to build better connections, real human connections, better relationships, in whatever types of relationships we may be imagining in our lives. That might be relationships with family, with friends. It might be relationships with those that we've known for a long time. But even though we've known them a long time, we realize it doesn't mean that the quality is always there or will continue to be there. It might be about relationships of those that we're just beginning to engage. They're new coworkers, new neighbors, people we're just possibly meeting. It's about building better relationships everywhere and anywhere as we move forward in life. And we feel this is really timely as we kind of move out of what might have seemed like a time to accentuate isolation into a time in which we embrace a call to greater intimacy, not just what's easy, but what's really good. And I would imagine that there is a wide range of relational quality in our life, that there are some here who may feel like, life has become hard in terms of relationships. It feels very limited, perhaps in the number of relationships that are bringing real connection in your life, or just the quality of the connection that's in your life. And you might feel like this is a time in which I want to break new ground. I need to break new ground. I need to be more intentional about this sphere of relationships, lest I keep experiencing life perhaps more alone than I'd like to. For other people here, there might be a sense in which I have really several significant and satisfying relationships, but you realize too that if we take those for granted, something happens about them. They tend to decline rather than develop. And you might be aware of that there's a sense in which I don't want my relational world, the people that I say that I love, to somehow become that which declines in its quality, becomes just comfortable rather than really connected. And that's what this series is really about. Jesus said that all of life, everything, if you brought it down to what's going to matter, he said this: it's about learning to love God and learning to love others. That's it. That's what life will come down to. That's the purpose. And if we miss that, we're going to find that we have ultimately really missed the purpose of our very existence, our very lives, of our deepest longings. And as I shared last week, when it comes down to finding ourselves at the very end of life, in the final moments of our earthly existence, I've never had anybody who said, you know what, please, bring me my diplomas. I need those diplomas that will give me a sense of affirmation. No one says, please bring me my trophies. No one says, please bring me my bank accounts. No, because those things have a way of all fading. And what we long for is to be at peace with God and to feel that we have invested in the love that we have with others. We want to have family and friends around us and to be in a right relationship with them, or to know that even if they have passed on, that we had a right relationship with them. That's what we long for. Because the truth is, life is not about accomplishments. It's about relationships. And it will oftentimes try to tell us the opposite. But life is not about accomplishments. It's about relationships. We want to know that we've loved well. And the more we face the truth that this isn't a dress rehearsal, by the way, this is our lives right now, the more we will start to realize this really matters. I want to get this right. And I'm not really sure that I'm always getting it right. It can be challenging. I don't know that I'm loving as well as I should. And that is why there's good news. As I shared last week, that we can learn to love people better. We can learn to grow in real connections and the quality of those connections. As we read last week from the scriptures, in the biblical book of Ephesians, the Apostle Paul is speaking of large things about what God has done to adopt us and to restore us and to lead us in how we can actually then bear the love of God. And he says this in Ephesians 5 verses 1 and 2. It says, imitate God, therefore, in everything you do, because you are his dear children. Live a life filled with love, following what? The example of Christ. He loved us and offered himself as a sacrifice for us, a pleasing aroma to God. He's saying we can learn from Jesus. There is no other source better to learn what it really means to love another person, to love imperfect people, by the way, because those are the only ones we get to love. There's no better source because he is the embodiment of the very nature of God in this world. And so we can turn and say he is bringing the love of God, the divine love, to bear in this world. He's the one we can look to. And he says and compares it to how we would look as children looking upon their parent. Go and watch it, because we all know that children have a way, and we all have had a way of looking at those who are raising us, and we look at the patterns of their life. And it's a frightening thought, but it's those patterns that really shape us. Not merely the words that are said, but looking at their actual lives. And as we see how they live, we begin to take that within ourselves. That can become our own pattern. So over the next 5 weeks, we are going to engage 5 of the most defining ways in which we can identify that Jesus loved people in a way that is very different than sometimes this world will form us to love. And I want to emphasize that it is about those defining patterns, because the idea of patterns helps us to realize this is not about something you develop in a moment. Patterns develop when you really take time to focus and look, and that's what we're going to do, begin to really look at Jesus deeply. And then you begin to identify and take those things in. And if we do, our lives will really change. And I want to encourage us by realizing that it's not simply about 5 simple truths, that as soon as you hear them, you become completely different and transformed in a moment, and you will love people perfectly for the rest of your lives. That might sound really nice. We love quick fixes. Anybody else? I love a quick fix. If I could just solve the deepest longings of my soul by a simple academic truth that if it's stated well, I will now be transformed. I love that to be true, but it's never true. Life is transformed as we take hold of the deepest truths deeply in our lives, and that is grasping those patterns. And that's what we're seeking to do. And I believe deeply that these are 5 of those things that really can transform us if we take them in to our lives, into our hearts. These are the kind of 5 things that I'm putting up over my desk because I know they need to last as things in my life. These are things that we do well to join into a life group and with other people so that we can begin to grasp them on a personal level, begin to sow them into our lives, and then begin to exercise them over time. So that's what we're looking at. And we begin with what Jesus described to his disciples today. When he said this, Jesus said in John 15:9, as the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. What's he saying that's so significant there? He's saying essentially this: as I live in the love of the Father, which he was setting his life in and doing so intentionally, as I do that, I am able and then to love you. love begets love. It is from love that we are able to love. And Jesus understands that God is love. That is the very nature of God. He is the very source of true love. Not everything that we call love, but actual true love. And in fact, we do well to realize that as we even use the word love, we've kind of a culture who's just lost any real meaning to it or differentiation between the ways in which we speak of love. And so there are many ways we may speak of it, but here we are talking about a divine love, that power that comes uniquely from God. Or we could say it this way, that love is the power that gives oneself to the good of another. That is not the same as many other ways we might speak of love, but it is this power we're speaking of. So if we are to love like Jesus, we won't simply try to find ourselves in another person, but rather we will seek that inner source from which we can give to others. That is the essence here. Or if we are to love like Jesus, we will begin by valuing the love that exists in God, in that source. Because if I want to love you, I can only love you if I myself know such love. That is where it emanates from. And so the first pattern that we're going to learn from Jesus could be described as this: embracing the me that is essential to we. Now that may sound a little bit strange. It sounds like maybe we're focusing on ourselves, but this is not at all suggesting that we focus more on ourselves. When I say embrace the me, it is about embracing that I am a self. And unless I do that and understand that I am a person who must be loved and who must be shaped by that love, I am not going to love well. Jesus confirmed the call to do what? Love your neighbor as yourself. That's always seemed a little strange. Like, I just want to love my neighbor. If you add the as yourself, aren't you saying that we should essentially become selfish? Like, I need to first be really selfish before I somehow try to be selfless? We're confused. Only a real self can love another self. Only that which is rooted in love will have the power to truly love. That's part of why we need to come to terms with the fact that it's only as we allow God to love us will we be able to love others. We have to start there. Because the truth is, if we really look at the world and we look at ourselves in the attempt to call ourselves to love other people, most of the time we're kind of like, okay, that sounds good. I'm empty. I'm empty. I don't got nothing for anybody. And what do we really have going on? Most of the time, we're more like two bankrupt businessmen trying to take a loan from the other person. How do two bankrupt people try to take a loan from? That's what we generally do in this world. Or as somebody said it, we're like two ticks and no dog. It just isn't going to go well. There's nothing to satisfy there. There's two things that need to suck the life out of another, but there's no life to be had. We have to get honest about that reality. It's the thing we want to avoid so much, that so much of what we say is love and we think of in terms of loving others is really just bringing our needs to each other and using each other to have those needs met. The very nature of relationships is relating. The only way two things relate is that there are two things. We cannot speak of connection unless what? There are two solid, real entities. Only they can connect. So we have to begin with ourselves as one of those entities. This is what it means to realize and embrace what it means that we are selves. Now, this is where you get a lot of people speaking today and using a common term called boundaries, because the word boundaries is to remind us that there are two entities and they must recognize each other and all their distinctions. The idea of boundaries merely is a way of speaking about how you and I need to embrace that we each, ourselves and another person, are defined in part by our own thoughts, our own feelings, our own desires. And that as we identify and recognize and embrace those within ourselves, we then need to learn how to recognize those, keep a certain boundary in which we are distinct from another. We don't try to merely blend the two together. Because the truth is, if we don't embrace that true self, if we don't realize that we are loved to be loved, we can tend to relate in one of a couple different ways. And many of you are very familiar with such thoughts. But I think it's important for us to grasp this for what we're considering today. And that is that we will tend to sometimes feel like I don't really have a self. So if I don't really have a self and embrace that and give significance to it, love as I am loved, then I will merely try to have you become myself, and I will merely give myself to you and to every woman which in you, and I will in no way love you by doing so. I will just try to serve you as the center, and in the end, you don't gain anything from it. Or I will feel so fragile in myself that I will feel threatened by anything that is distinct from me because it threatens my own existence, because I don't feel very solid as a person. So I feel threatened by you having different thoughts and different feelings and different desires. And so what will I try to do? But I will try to control you to comply. Because if you confront those differences, I feel that I will not really be valid, that I will not be the center I've been trying to be. And so we tend to, end up over kind of giving ourselves to another, or we can tend to try to control. And in all these ways, what we're not doing is loving others as ourselves. The truth is that loving others must be rooted in being loved. If we reject ourselves, we are only going to do what? Bring that spirit of rejection to other people. If we don't feel that we are loved and worthy to be loved, if we haven't confronted that issue within ourselves, the truth is that I'm going to become critical of you. If I'm unresolved in finding grace for myself, I promise you, I will become very critical of you and what I don't feel comfortable with in you. Most critical people, find someone who's really critical, and maybe you even identify that way. Most really critical people have struggled to find grace for themselves. And that is where that kind of emanates from. As many have noted, wounded people tend to wound people. So if we are going to love, we have to be drawn to that love. And the answer lies in that affirmation that we read in 1 John, where it says, we love him because he first loved us. We don't merely bring love. Love has to emanate first from God so that we're able to love God and love us. The first step, the good news, is the initiation is taken by God. And the more that we're rooted in God's love, the more we can extend it. But as we seek to do that and be loved by God, we are going to have to face something. We're going to have to be confronting our own kind of false identities, all the ways that we've perhaps been lied to about who we really are, all the ways in which we've tried to feel value for ourselves but haven't really known it, so we've sold our own identities. These are the things that will be confronted. And this pattern, this confrontation, this need to embrace ourselves and bring ourselves is what we see at the very beginning of Jesus' life. Look with me in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 3, where it speaks this. Jesus is now just turning. He's chosen some to follow. It's going to be the launch, the beginning of his public ministry, of doing what God has called him to do in this world. And it says, as he was praying, heaven was open, and the Holy Spirit descended on him in bodily form like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, you are my son, whom I love, with whom I am well pleased. Now Jesus himself was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. Here in this moment, we have the blessing of the Father upon him. And it says the Holy Spirit is there, present. This is an incredible picture right here of what we would later think of as the Trinity. of Father, Son, and Spirit, and the blessing that is upon him. It's this definitive claim upon his life. It declares who he truly is. And there we see that he is the one who has lived in the love of the Father and the Spirit and the unity of those things. And it's this blessing of the Father that is now upon him. But what we need to understand, it's that very blessing that Jesus wants us to know. The very thing in which it is now being announced over who he is and what he is going to be able to bring to bear is what he wants in our own way to know. He is the only eternal Son. There is no other who has lived in the love of the Father, but he's come for us because we as humanity bear the very image of God. We are the ones that are to be loved in a way as children would be loved. The same love of the Father is there for us. This blessing is there for us. And it's a blessing that we all long to know. And we will never, ever live well or love well until our lives are able to literally live in that blessing. And the more deeply we can live in that blessing, and few of us do as deeply as we would like, but the more deeply we live in that blessing, the more deeply we can live out of that blessing. And the truth is, I believe that every human life has some capacity to love even now, because many people who don't have any relationship with God we may experience in them as having an element of love that maybe is greater than our own or greater than others, and that shouldn't be shocking to us because we are all those who still bear something of the marred image of God within us. We all have the echoes of this blessing within us, but we have turned away from it. We're never living out of it at the depths we should. The only way we're going to grow is if we live into this blessing. And so we have this moment in which we see this in Jesus, and we might think, this is it. Wow, that's it. Got it. He was blessed. He's going to live out of that blessing. But as many of you know what now takes place, it's not that simple. And we continue where it says this. Right after this blessing, it says, Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, left the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. He ate nothing during those 40 days, and at the end of them was hungry. And it goes on to explain how in that time, then, there's an enemy of his soul, an enemy that rules over this world who tries to come and to lay claim to him. So he's immediately led into this. And let's be sure we catch this. Who led him into the wilderness? The devil? No. It says the Holy Spirit. God himself was leading him, Jesus, into this. Why? Because this is an intentional process that he's going to go through. He is being brought into this very hard process. It's not a trap. It's more of a trial, more of a testing the determination of that blessing that has just been announced over him, to bring it into confrontation with one who wants to challenge that, who wants to lay claim to Jesus. We need to catch that, because that is a pattern, as we're going to see, that comes. There's a conflict that must be confronted, a determination that must be forged more deeply. And this involves going alone, not totally alone in a spiritual sense, but alone in all the ways that we would normally find. It's a state he's brought into of being hungry, of being weak, of being alone. And it's in such a space and a state that sometimes the deepest determinations are forged. Many of us know that, we've had dynamic times where we have been relaxing in the shade and everything's going well and we're having wonderful meals, our stomachs are full, and we feel the blessing of God. But the truth is, most of us would probably say that it's in the times in which I felt the most conflict, I felt alone, that I had to work out the type of inner conflicts, the type of resolution inside that changed me most profoundly. And that is what we're seeing here. And what would he face? He faces being kind of worn down and being ultimately then presented with these alternatives of provision. For the enemy comes to him and says, you are hungry. You need bread? Here is, on my terms, here's bread. On my terms, I'll provide for you. On my terms, you feel weak. On my terms, I will show you ways to feel strong. But it's on my terms because I'm going to lay claim to your life. That blessing, forget that blessing. I will now be the source that defines you. This is the kind of confrontation that is coming. And we won't go through each of these three temptations specifically, but as many may recall, the enemy comes to him on 3 different times during this time. And essentially was saying to him is this, that I want you to sell your identity, the one that has been given to you, the one that that you've been called now to know yourself to be. I want you to really sell that to me, but it won't look like selling it. It will look like just taking an alternative identity and another way of feeling good about yourself. I'll give you the world's forms of power and provision, of popularity. I can give you all that. Just sell your identity. That is the confrontation that we see there. And the essential point of this is that this time in the wilderness alone was essential for Jesus to take hold of that identity. And let me tell you something. There's a reason why the enemy had to go after him in that moment. Because if Jesus actually was able to take hold and live out that blessing of the Father, to have been the one who brought eternal love into this world and was able to love this world, then he becomes the most dangerous thing that ever entered this world as far as the prince of this world, the devil, was concerned. We become dangerous if we actually take hold of the ability to be loved by God and to bring that love to bear. And that is why this confrontation is one that's dramatic and is hard. It's in the wilderness, though, that we and he became dangerous. And so we sometimes see this as such a dramatic process. And we think, oh my gosh, this is just like a one-off. This is like some cosmic trial. And when it's done and Jesus emerges, he's now unstoppable. That's awesome. It's all done and taken care of, a one-off. But here's the thing that's most surprising. The very next thing we imagine is like Jesus is like, oh man, that was incredible. I never want to go through that again. I would avoid being alone in that situation. Wow, I don't want to deal with that. That's what we think. But we read in the very next chapter, just a few verses later, at daybreak, Jesus went out to a solitary place, and the crowds were looking for him. They came to him and tried to keep him from leaving. And what we start to find is this statement over and over and over. Jesus arose in the morning, went off to where? The wilderness. He kept going back. What we find is that what those 40 days represented in the most extreme or more dramatic, Jesus is now building into a pattern in his life. We read in just the next chapter, it says this, Jesus often withdrew to the wilderness for prayer. Take that in for a moment. He just had this experience. We think this is something to avoid. We assume he would too, but yet here it says, he often withdrew to the wilderness to pray. He knew that he needed to be intentional about pursuing this and holding on to that. Jesus was engaging a world of lives. He knew that we're like sheep without a shepherd. And as they would come after him, they would have their own needs. And they would want him to just satisfy their needs. But Jesus is not going to be one who just gives himself to the whims and wishes of other people. He's got to stay rooted in the love of the Father above all. That's the only way he's going to be able to then love the whole world and fulfill that mission to do so. And that is why he takes hold of and invests in that voice and that voice alone in which he can draw out and be loved. It was out of the eternal blessing that he could bless. It was out of the eternal love that he could love. And that is true of us. So we do well to follow this pattern and to see it as the very beginning of how we're going to love like Jesus, how we're going to love other people better. It begins by embracing ourselves as what we bring to the we. Or to say it this way, this pattern, that we bring our genuine presence before the presence of God to allow God's love to reclaim us from the false identities of this world, recenter us from mere whims and wishes around us, and fill us with the source of original affirmation that can be shared then with others. If we were to just unpack that for just a moment before we're done, the point is this: forming a healthy me in order to have a healthy we then involves these aspects that we can draw from Jesus' pattern. One, we bring our genuine presence. That sounds simple, just show up. But I think the truth is we oftentimes have this weird idea that I just want to sit in the presence of God, but I don't know if God will be there. I think God's always there. And he's saying, I just don't know if you'll show up. Oh, you might try to sit down in some kind of fabricated way, some weird false self, but have you really brought yourself, your real self? Or is that just too uncomfortable? I think we have the hard time showing up when it comes to this relationship. Bringing our genuine presence refers to daring to be real. Jesus went in the wilderness, and there it says that he was hot and he was hungry. In other words, everything was taken. He's alone. It meant that all the ways in which we normally would find our well-being, all those attachments, they weren't there. He had no carpenter shop to sit there and say, look what I've made. I'm really proud of this stuff. This is who I am. No carpenter shop. He had no crowds of people to praise him and say, look, they think I'm really cool. None of that. He's alone. And we have to face that time where we're not attached to those things. We can break from those things. And so we need to realize that we're not talking about just spending time alone. I think this is really important. Because many of us think, oh, hey, I know how to spend time alone. Every introvert's going, I'm all over it. I love time alone. But the truth is, if we're honest, we can spend time alone. That's not about really becoming more real and connecting with God. It's more of a distraction. The truth is, we can all spend more time alone that's less about developing our life with God and more about just distracting ourselves from the reality of who we are. We can all spend time alone, especially in our current culture. I can crank up music anywhere I am. I can binge watch all night long till I fall asleep. I can go off in the internet and find 1,000 holes of interesting things to just run down. We can all do that. But it's not really about facing our own selves before God, where he can meet us in our real selves. And that is why we need to understand it's about not merely being alone, but coming as our genuine selves before God. If we want to grow, we need to decide to choose space away from those things. Now, there is nothing wrong with wanting to take time to just check out, and any of the things that I mentioned, there can be a place, but we have got to face the fact that what we need is time in which we are coming genuinely before God. Because there is so much a part of us that wants to just go and be attached to those things and live out of the ideas that we have about ourselves. But God can't meet us there. Why? Because that's just a fabrication sometimes. The only person he can love is you, the real you. The false self that I make up about myself, he can't love it because it doesn't exist, as Brennan Manning says. As Brennan Manning, the late Brennan Manning wrote, silent solitude makes true speech possible and personal. If I am not in touch with my own belovedness, then I cannot touch the sacredness of others. If I am estranged from myself, I am likewise a stranger to others. If I am estranged from myself, I am ultimately estranged from others. When I get honest, I admit I'm a bundle of paradoxes. I believe and I doubt. I hope and I get discouraged. I love and I hate. I feel bad when I'm feeling good. I feel guilty about not feeling guilty. I am trusting and suspicious. I am honest and I still play games. To live by grace means to acknowledge my whole life story, the light side and the dark side. In admitting my shadow side, I learn who I am currently and what God's grace means. How true it is. Only as we come in all that honesty are we able to experience the unconditional love, the grace of God. And so we come with our genuine presence and we come before God's presence, which is to say that we're not merely coming to find some kind of simple, vague idea of self-esteem that we just draw upon. That means any way in which we can just feel better. That's not what this is. Now, there's many ways in which you and I might find our well-being, if we were to use that generally, can be lifted some. It might be exercise and eating well and spending time with the right kind of people. All these things can be good. They're God-given ways to feel better, and we can certainly want to encourage each other in those things, but none of those things will tell us who we are. And then they just become other ways in which we try to find our identity, perhaps. Well, look, I'm getting more fit. Look, I'm losing weight. All those things, and that's all we can pass on to another person. In other words, we're telling them to just do these things. Now, there's got to be a part of us that also knows, I am loved. I know who I am. And that's what's unique about coming to God. And there, thirdly, we learn about really what it means to reclaim our true identity. It's there that we face and are able to face the false selves and all the ways in which we have kind of believed a lot of things that just aren't true, and we have kind of bought into many things that have been told to us. We do well before we close to just recall that this all began long ago. We're told in the very beginning of the book of the Bible in Genesis that as soon as humanity tried to live apart from God, it all began when a serpent came and said, "Did God say that? Let me tell you," and offered an alternative to what God had just told to humanity about itself. In other words, it all began in a lie and us giving trust to a lie. And then when we see that Adam and Eve have taken of the fruit and God comes to say, you are stepped out of this life in which we've been united. And, God can see everything, but what does Adam do? You remember? He's feeling kind of ashamed. He's feeling like he wants to hide from God. So now in his nakedness, it says he takes fig leaves and tries to sew them together, kind of a silly idea, and tries to cover himself with fig leaves. And we're just like, that is so weird. That's so dumb, Adam. God can see you. We've been doing it ever since. We've been trying to cover ourselves with so many things to hide our own shame. And this is what it means to come and realize I need to see that I've been trying to cover myself. What is it that is not real and true? What is it that I need to do to now meet God once again in all of my metaphorical nakedness and allow myself to be met by his grace? Because what we need to realize is just as the enemy came to Jesus with specific ways of saying, I see your hunger. I know what you want. You want bread? Okay, then let's talk about bread. In other words, he came with specific ways to try to manipulate Jesus, to try to give an alternative to who he was. And he will do the same with us. And each of us have things that when we come and try to sit alone, guess what? Those conflicts, those lies, we're going to be confronted with them. That's why, have you ever found it hard to kind of sit really alone with yourself? It is kind of hard, if we're honest. We really start to feel like, gosh, I start to get uncomfortable. I start to have these negative feelings. I start to have doubts. I start to swirl with things. It's because there's these underlying things that have kind of claimed us. They have been trying to claim us. You might begin to hear these kinds of truths where you hear these lies saying, you need to do more.
Oh, gosh, yeah, I guess I need to do more. That's what I've always taken on. Or you need someone else to save you. Or no one could really love you. Or you're such an imposter, you might as well just stay hiding, because if anybody figures out that you're not who you've said you are and they really see all the other stuff, you're done with. So just keep hiding. Or you're only valuable when you really do well and you make sure that you make other people feel good about themselves or proud. Or so you better just keep performing really, really well. All of these things become insidious things that we might have to confront. As they arise, I will tell you, what we're going to want to do is avoid them, get uncomfortable, and get out of there. But here's the truth. We need to persevere. We need to realize these are the things that the enemy has controlled me with. These are the kinds of lies that have been defining my life, and I have kind of perhaps sold my identity to these ideas. If you're going to take them back, and I need to take many things back, then I need to actually let those things come up and recognize them and begin to realize this is what I need to confront. And this is why we need to listen. This is why we might begin to discover things that are really hard, and maybe we take those to a friend or a counselor, and we say, this is, I think, a lie that's had a hold of my life. It's directing me, it's defining me. I want God to define me. So maybe we spend some time really being willing to see those things, being willing to work with those things. And I just want to close with grasping this as you pursue this, as we consider this pattern, to recognize this. Don't be surprised by how hard it is to do this. We're going to find that when we dare to say, I want God's love to be that which defines me. I want to love out of that love. So I need to bring my real self and all of this conflict within me. Guess what? It's uncomfortable. And you know what happens? You know what happens. You sit down to be alone with yourself, with God, and suddenly there's an amazing amount of distractions that come pouring in around you. Suddenly, like you hear the toaster 3 rooms away. Like everything gets louder and amplified. And your mind says, I just thought of 10 things I need to do. And I'm making a grocery list about them. And then there's conflicts within ourselves. All these things come up. Oh my gosh, this is hard. Like I'm thinking things that I don't want to think. Guess what? It's hard, but it's good. Don't be afraid of these things. We're going to want to flee them, silence them, but we do well to identify them so that we can confront them. And it may seem like we're not accomplishing anything. If I just spend time with God, if I get up in the morning and that's the first thing I go to do, come on. I have so many important things to do. I have more things that are so important to do in this world. It needs me. And you know what? It does. And there is a lot of things important for you to do. But we need to confront this fact. The truth is God's saying, the world does need your energy. But you know what it needs more than anything? It needs you to know who you are. It needs you to dare to bear the love that I have for this world more than anything else. This world will be okay if you don't get everything done. I know that's frightening for some of us, but you will not love others and bring and bear the love of God if you don't know who you are. I think of the people in Israel who wandered. Some of you may recall that the Israelites were trying to find their way to the promised land. And, it was about a 4 to 40-day journey perhaps, but not 40 years. And they spent 40 years wandering, and we think that was a waste of time. Why 40 years? We could have gotten there and got things going. But God seemed to understand that it didn't matter so much just that they reached their destination, but who they were becoming when they got there. And that's the way he feels about you. He cares about who you're becoming as you go forward. He's not as concerned about time and achievement the way we are, because he knows what really matters is that you be shaped by his love. As Jesus said, essentially in John 15, he's trying to explain some of this. And he says, you need to abide in me. If you abide in me, your life will bear fruit. As I abide in the Father, So you abide in me, and your life will bear fruit. The very things that really matter will come from your life as you give yourself to embracing that me that can bring something to a healthy we. And so I want to close us with a very simple prayer, just as a way to think about how you might use this as a pattern in the simplest moment. Not just in the morning, but it could be the morning. Not just in the evening, but it could be the evening. But it could be at any time in the day. Many people have learned that what we need to do sometimes is like just have something that we build to kind of connect us back to God. Some of us are going to go, man, I'm not sure if I'm up for 40 days of not eating like Jesus did. You don't need to be. I mean, that could be something some here have done. But some of us need to realize it's not just about what we can do in 40 days or 40 hours or even 4 minutes. It's about the heart of what we bring as a pattern, as a practice. So I want to put this simple prayer to you. It's just a way to exercise it. And it's this: God, I belong to you. May your will become my will. May your love become my love. That summarizes so much of what Jesus really brought to bear in that time. He belonged to the Father. His will would be given to the Father, and his love would now become the love that he brings. So I want to invite you to just join me. Would you just stand for a moment? And those of you online can join in sharing this simple prayer. Let's say it at one time aloud together, and then we'll just speak it as more of a quiet prayer. God, I belong to you. May your will become my will. May your love become my love. Let's pray. God, our prayer is today really that we would dare to maybe do the hardest thing of all in learning to love others, that we would join this pattern of learning to be loved, not in selfishness, but in realizing that we want the power to love other people. We want the power to give to the good of others. And so we ask that you would help us to form the courage to bring ourselves, to really bring our own presence, real presence before you, God, and there to go through the process of confronting how you want to reclaim us from a lot of false stuff, and you want to restore us in your love. And so in our own hearts, we want to say, God, we belong to you. We want to say to the enemy of our souls, we belong to God and to no other. May your will become my will. May your love become our love. May we become, in our own way, dangerous in our capacity to bear your love in this world. Let's worship in response.